Now I have the honor to invite Ms. Kulani to come here and deliver her opening remarks.
Thank you, Professor Bakala Gutama. He is the chairman of the local committee. Akambultan Hundekesan. Good morning. Baganagan Hundekesan as Gaysan. I want to warmly welcome each of you to the 33rd Oromo Studies Association Annual Conference and the very first OSA conference to take place in Finfinne. Guyya irra manamanatti fakkaata ammoo humna waaqayyoon OSA'n biyya seene dhugaan uummata isaatiif tajaajiluun baay'ee na gammachiisa. Today, all of us are making history by participating in this OSA conference in Finfinne. OSA was founded in 1986 in the United States by a group of activist scholars and students who wanted to create an independent academic institution that would expand and enrich the field of Oromo studies. And for over the past 3 decades, OSA has been laying the academic and intellectual foundation for rebuilding Oromo national identity, historical and indigenous knowledge, and an intellectual, as well as Oromoma, which is the storehouse of Oromo history, culture, and pride. It is also a very resilient institution. It has survived various forms of challenges and subversion over the past 3 decades. And it continues to shine today as the premier platform for scholarship and scholars of Oromo studies. In addition to publishing the Journal of Oromo Studies every year, OSA holds 2 academic conferences, and these conferences serve as a springboard for presenting historical and contemporary studies, research, and policy recommendations for addressing intractable challenges in this country and the Horn of Africa region. OSA was born, raised, and cultivated in exile. So today, as I said, is a dream come true, because for the first time in its 33-year history, the OSA annual conference is taking place in its motherland. Before I say anything further about the significance of this day, I want us all to recognize the most significant reason regarding how this dream of bringing OSA to Finfinne became a reality. On November 12, 2015, a peaceful protest erupted in the town of Ginchi, near Ambo, against the privatization and illegal confiscation of a small soccer field in a nearby forest. Very soon after, as the world witnessed, this protest sparked an intense nationwide protest movement led by the Qeerroo Qarree generation against land grabbing and other accumulated grievances in Oromia and beyond. The Qeerroo Qarree generation are Oromo youth, as young as elementary students, all the way up to university students. Land was at the heart of the Qeerroo Qarree protest movement, but the protest soon engulfed demands for a regime change and democratic and criminal justice reform across Ethiopia. And this youth-led protest movement expanded further as marginalized groups across Ethiopia, including the Konso, Sidama, Amara, Gurage, and Somali, joined in solidarity. From the 2015 through 2018 protest movement, thousands of these students were detained, tortured, or killed because of their participation or support for the protest movement, as reported by several international human rights NGOs. But what is sometimes not recognized is this generation was continuing Oromo youth protests that took place from 2005 all the way through 2014. The Qeerroo Qarree generation was carrying the torch of grassroots mobilization from the movement known as Fincila Didda Gabruma, which was the Oromo youth protest movement from a decade earlier. Oromo youth in Oromia have been peacefully protesting and demanding fair and authentic representation and substantive democracy far beyond the last 3 years. And I also have to note that the youth movement was also a continuation of the Oromo national struggle that has been taking place for a quarter of a century now. So today, I would like for all of us to recognize that it is the youth generation's grassroots activism, courage, unrelenting dedication, and sacrifices for many years that paved the way for OSA to be here, and also for this wave, for this era of transition. This era of transition is a gift. This era is a gift to this entire country, rooted in the sacrifices of the Qeerroo Qarree generation. So please, let us all rise, stand up for a moment of silence to recognize the Qeerroo Qarree generation for their ultimate sacrifice of life and well-being that many experienced. Galatoma. But while we recognize the sacrifices of this generation, as well as the sacrifices of their families and their parents, and as we celebrate their achievements, which have brought us to this moment in history, we must also equally recognize that this youth generation's grievances, for the most part, remain unanswered. The accumulated grievances regard political and social self-determination for marginalized peoples across the country, the need for authentic representation, the dispossession of land and livelihoods from farmers, the continuation of land grabbing policies, accountability for systemic human rights abuses, comprehensive criminal justice and judiciary reform, rampant poverty and unemployment. So for these next 3 days, our underlying mission in this conference is to be an institutional platform for scholars to closely examine, discuss, and produce evidence-based policy recommendations to address these grievances that were highlighted by the Qeerroo Qarree generation and that now still plague the country. OSA's mission is not only about reclaiming our history and identity, it is also about paving a roadmap for how all marginalized peoples in this country can overcome marginalization peacefully and can democratically coexist and thrive. An underlying mission of this OSA annual conference is to gather together and unify historically marginalized perspectives and voices in Oromia and across Ethiopia in order to explore new ideas and policies for entering a new frontier that reimagines governance, economic reform, our relationship with the environment, the study and use of our diverse forms of indigenous knowledge. And I must add that respects and values diversity. Diversity in Ethiopia is a reality that cannot be denied, and in fact, it is a strength and not a weakness. So recognizing and respecting cultural, linguistic, and political diversity in this country is now clearly an issue of survival and the only path towards authentic democracy. So you will see in the program that we have local scholars presenting from the Oromo, Sidama, Aniwak, Somali, Hadia, and Omo, as well as international scholars of marginalized peoples coming from Eritrea, Uganda, Kenya, Canada, Greece, Italy, the United States, England, Germany, Kuwait, and the UAE. In other words, this conference is a historical union of local, diaspora, and international scholars who are here to expand and enrich solutions-oriented thinking about how to achieve substantive democracy, sustainable development, and peaceful coexistence for all diverse ethno-nations. But before I delve a little further into what we'll be covering these next few days, I want to take a step back briefly to look back in order for us to look forward, to briefly explore the journey of Osa and its arrival to this moment in time. As I stated previously, our program is predominantly represented by marginalized voices in this country. But in the late 1960s, the colonized peoples of this country, including the Oromo, Sidama, Walaita, Somali, and Haidia, were less than 10% of the student population of Haile Selassie, the first university, which is now Addis Ababa University. In other words, a majority of this country's population was represented by less than 10% in the highest institution of education in Ethiopia at the time. I quote this statistic to highlight how Ethiopia's education policies historically restricted politically marginalized peoples from access to education and the production of knowledge. This delayed the emergence of an educated class within the Oromo and other marginalized peoples, and as you can imagine, the ripple effect of such discrimination was felt in realms beyond the university and included the government, business, the arts, and other sectors of society. And access to knowledge and knowledge production had been limited to those whose identity reflected that of the dominating elites at the time. Concurrently, the field of Ethiopian studies had both neglected and devalued the history, culture, and knowledge and indigenous institutions of the richly diverse ethno-nations of this country. For example, Ethiopianist scholars fabricated myths about the origins of the Oromo and referred to the Oromo by the derogatory term Galla, which means slave, savage, and barbaric. Such scholars negatively depicted the Oromo as a people without a history or a civilization. Ethiopian studies also neglected to accurately and historically reflect the formation of the modern state of Ethiopia and the social, cultural, and economic structures that underpinned this formation. In the 1950s and 1960s, a very small educated Oromo class began to emerge, which culminated in the formation of the Macha Tuluma Association in 1963. But it was in the 1970s, which was the era of upheaval, revolution, and resistance in Ethiopia, that a more pronounced Oromo educated class began to rise and expand. And by the 1980s and early 1990s, we started to see a pronounced emergence of Oromo studies by both Oromo and non-Oromo scholars. This emergence or first wave of Oromo studies not only began to address the gaps, distortions, and misinformation regarding the Oromo people in Ethiopian studies, but it also revealed to the world the complexity and achievements of a culture, history, and knowledge of a people who had been disregarded and misrepresented in scholarly studies. For example, in 1973, Professor Asmarom Lagasa, who was our guest speaker tomorrow, who's sitting right in front of me, authored the book Gara, 3 Approaches to the Study of African Society. And this was a landmark publication on the indigenous democratic governance system of the Oromo, called Gara. In 1974, Professor John Makarkas, who also joins us and who will be a guest speaker this morning, published Ethiopia, Anatomy of a Traditional Polity, which also contributed to Oromo studies. In 1980, Garamelba, which is a pseudonym, authored Oromia, an introduction, which was published covertly here in Finfiné, and which is the very first book that had Oromia in its title. In 1988, Professor Mkuria Bulcha, who's also joining us, and who will be a presenter this evening, and who was a founding member of OSA, published Flight and Integration, Causes of Mass Exodus from Ethiopia and Problems of Integration in the Sudan. And this was the first book that explored the connection between Ethiopian colonialism and the dislocation and explosive growth of refugees from this country. In 1989, Lambert Bartel authored Oromo Religion, Myths and the Rights of the Western Oromo of Ethiopia, an attempt to understand, in which he places indigenous Oromo religion, Waqifanna, at the center of Oromo's traditional modes of experiencing the divine. In 1980, Professor Muhammad Hassan, who will be also joining us as a guest keynote speaker tomorrow, and who was a founding member of OSA, authored The Oromo of Ethiopia, a history, which was a pioneering historical examination of the independent existence and pre-colonial history and institutions of the Oromo in the Gibbe region. Also in 1990, Bani Holcomb and the late Sisai Ibsa authored The Invention of Ethiopia, the making of a dependent colonial state in Northeast Africa, which was a trailblazing scholarship on the formation of the modern Ethiopian state. Bani Holcomb, also known as Adik Abene, was a founding member of OSA, and she is sitting in the front row. She will be our keynote speaker this morning. The late Sisai Ibsa was one of the most key founding members of OSA. And I can't forget, of course, authored in 1993 by my father, Oromia in Ethiopia, State Formation and Ethno-National Conflict, was also a landmark contribution to the study of the capitalistic underpinnings of the formation of the modern Ethiopian state. And this book profoundly demonstrates that Oromia is an entity that has its own independent historical and sociological existence, complex civilization, democratic governance, and culture. And my father will also be a presenter in this conference, and he was also a founding member of OSA. And there have also been hundreds of scholarly articles published in regional and international journals that have put the Oromo people on a global map, particularly the article by Professor Paul Baxter written in 1978 entitled Ethiopia's Unacknowledged Problem. After this article was published, the Derg banned Professor Baxter from entering Ethiopia. And these are just a few examples of pioneering scholarship on the Oromo, most of which was by OSA's scholars. And I could go on, and I don't mean to leave out any other pioneering scholarship, especially since we saw a rapid proliferation of more publications, books, and articles throughout the 1990s and 2000s by OSA scholars. But my point is that OSA was formed to develop, cultivate, and enrich Oromo studies and scholarship on the Oromo, and it has been productively working on this mission. And further, I must add that the publications of these scholars have directly or indirectly contributed to the revival and development of Oromo history, culture, and identity, Oromuma, which has certainly played a role in galvanizing the Oromo national movement as well as the Qeerroo and Qarree peaceful movement. So I've briefly laid out the historical map, this historical map to illustrate that this OSA conference is the culmination of the work of decades of scholars producing Oromo scholarship. And it's the culmination of advocates and supporters who have worked in OSA to create and cultivate a space for the development of Oromo knowledge and cultural, scientific, and political history. And this was the rich legacy that was passed down to me when I entered this year of my OSA presidency. And now that I've briefly explained how we got here, I want to explain now what is in store for this annual conference and where I believe OSA should be headed as we move into the future. OSA is an institution that has thrived on bringing together marginalized voices and perspectives. And this is a reflection of the cooperative and peaceful essence of Oromo culture, and also a testament to the ethos of the founding members of this organization. The conference program you have in your hands is the product of our invitation to historically marginalized groups across Ethiopia, to renowned scholars of the Oromo and other marginalized groups that are across Ethiopia that are located here and all over the world, to come together, to cooperate collectively, and to harness our collective knowledge in order to reimagine, rebuild, and revitalize systems and institutions in Ethiopia. We are here to lay a roadmap, a blueprint, with tangible policy recommendations for how to address the most significant governance, economic, social, and environmental questions of this era in this multicultural, multinational state. And as you will see in the program, we've divided the 3 days into 3 main plenaries. In today's plenary, Reimagining the State, we will ask, how can we ensure that the Ethiopian state, its regions, and its cities, including this capital city, are designed so that the diverse ethno-nations of this country can live peacefully, harmoniously, and democratically together? How can we reinterpret the cultural diversity and indigenous knowledge derived from such diversity as a strength and a source of knowledge for democratic institution building? What policies would ensure that the diverse marginalized peoples of this country are authentically represented? Tomorrow, our second plenary is focused on revitalizing indigenous institutions. We will examine the knowledge infused within our indigenous institutions, the challenges with revitalizing such institutions, and how such indigenous knowledge can and should shape our social, legal, and political policies and institutions to empower women, youth, and other underrepresented people. And as the title of the plenary indicates, we are looking back to look forward, because it is imperative that we recognize our own indigenous philosophies and knowledge, not just as cultural achievements, but as tools for overcoming some of the most serious challenges we face as a society. On day 3, we will approach the third plenary on new approaches to just and sustainable development from multiple directions, through economic policy reform, through the participation and empowerment of local and indigenous communities, through environmental justice, through sustainable agricultural reform and investment, and through the energy and creativity of our youth generation. And at the heart of this plenary is the dire need for authentic representation in decision-making in order to ensure inclusive development. I want to now express my deepest gratitude to the presenters, the guest speakers, and keynote speakers in this program, and I'm very much looking forward to their presentations and the conversations and dialogue that will ensue for these next 3 days. As I was planning this conference, I kept asking myself one question over and over, which was, what will be OSA's legacy? For decades, OSA has been reclaiming our history and cultivating our various forms of knowledge, and we must continue to do that work. But I also think we must aggressively take up the challenge of being a platform for all marginalized voices, and we must lay a blueprint for a peaceful future for all in this country. That is what I think our legacy will be, what it should be, which is to always provide the institutional push that is necessary for progress. As I mentioned previously, the plenary topics chosen for this conference are about addressing the grievances of the Qeerroo Qarree movement, and so we shall continue to push with the Qeerroo Qarree generation. I am incredibly honored to have had this opportunity to plan this conference, and we received a record number of papers, over 130, And I want to sincerely thank everyone who submitted. We also received hundreds of requests from young people interested in volunteering and contributing their time. And a lot of those volunteers are in the back. They have really contributed a lot of their energy to this conference, and I deeply appreciate them. Before I conclude, I also would like to express my heartfelt thanks and appreciation to everyone who assisted in making this conference happen. I would like to thank the OSA board, which is chaired by Professor Asfa Bayana. It also includes Professor Muhammad Hassan, Professor Guluma Gamada, my father, Dr. Tafari Margo, Amane Badasso, and Professor Badasa Tadasa. And I would also like to thank, of course, the executive committee, which includes Professor Samuel Jalata, Dr. Benya Ugasa, Roberta Tassisa, and Garamu Benya. And I cannot leave out the local task force, which is headed by Dr. Asabo Regasa, who has really been the connective tissue of the logistics of this conference. And he has been working tirelessly behind the scenes. And we must all recognize and appreciate him, and also the many volunteers who have been working day and night for these past few days to create this beautiful forum for us all. I would also like to express my appreciation for the local committee, which is headed by Dr. Bakala Gutama, who introduced me. The OSA Conference Committee in the United States, which included Adik Abane, Dr. Daniel Ayana, Ayanta Tibeso, and Galan Haile. And all other OSA committees. There are several OSA committees. I'm sorry I cannot name all of them, but they all lent their time and energy to this historic project. Also, thanks to Amantisa Ifa, who is recording this conference, and his assistants. And lastly, our sponsors. I want to express my deepest gratitude to Awash Insurance Company and Awash Bank, and of course, my very deepest appreciation to Rift Valley University, our host and sponsor, to its owner, Opo Dinku Deyesa, and to the university manager, Dr. Ababa Gamachu, who is sitting in the front. They were exceptionally generous and welcoming, and really are the main reason why OSA in Finfinne has come to life. I want to note that a lot of scholars that we have invited here today, that we have collected, are pillars in Oromo studies and society, and I stand here on the shoulders of giants. And I can't express how much of an honor it is to have invited those giants to be here today. And I thank them for their lifelong, unwavering commitment to Oromo studies. And finally, I want to note that I was born and raised in the United States, but I also grew up in OSA. My parents brought my brother and I, Beka Jalata, to every OSA conference since I was born. I've probably missed one or two, but I basically grew up in OSA, and so did my brother, and I deeply appreciate my parents for giving us that opportunity and for not leaving me behind to get lost in another culture or society, and for instilling in me an authentic and true understanding of my identity, my cultural roots, and my ancestors' legacies. That is one of the greatest gifts that one can give one's child. During this journey of bringing OSA to Finfinne, to be frank, not only for this conference, but for my entire life, my parents have been my biggest supporters and have always encouraged me to fulfill my dreams, one of which was bringing OSA to Finfinne. Galatoma Abbako Fiharako. And finally, this is really the last point. I cannot leave out my final thanks to you, each and every one of you, for coming here and joining us, the Oromo Studies Association, on this historic day. I am really overwhelmed and impressed by this level of participation, and it should give us all hope about where we are headed. Gudda galatoma ufata amma walgai haeglu. Before we begin, I have the honor of welcoming the honor of welcoming President Shamalis Abdissa, the President of Oromia, to the stage to give opening remarks before the conference begins.